What if every random coincidence in your life is actually a message? What if that person you were just thinking about who suddenly called, that book that fell open to exactly the passage you needed, or that chance encounter that changed everything, weren't chance at all, but meaningful connections revealing a deeper pattern in reality that our conventional understanding of causality can't explain? Tonight, we continue our exploration of Jung's revolutionary psychology by examining one of his most controversial yet fascinating concepts: synchronicity, the principle of a causal connection through meaning rather than cause and effect. Building on our previous discussions of the shadow, projection, the curse of consciousness, the anima and animus, prophetic dreams, the inflated ego, collective psychology, happiness-seeking, spiritual experience, and the unconscious as warning system, we now turn to a dimension of Jung's work that challenges our fundamental understanding of reality itself. What you'll discover may transform how you perceive the seemingly random events in your life, and by the end, you'll understand why Jung believed synchronicity might represent evidence for a profound connection between psyche and matter that modern science is only beginning to comprehend. A connection that suggests reality is far more mysterious and meaning-centered than our conventional materialist worldview allows. Beyond causality, when meaning creates connection, to appreciate the revolutionary nature of Jung's concept of synchronicity, we must first understand how radically it challenges our conventional understanding of how the world works. Since the Enlightenment, Western thinking has been dominated by what philosophers call causal determinism, the assumption that every event must be caused by prior events in a linear chain of cause and effect. Within this framework, coincidences are simply random intersections in these causal chains, meaningless accidents with no significance beyond their immediate circumstances. But Jung observed something different in both his personal experience and clinical practice: the recurring phenomenon of meaningful coincidences that seemed connected not through conventional causality, but through their significance to the individuals experiencing them. These events, which he eventually termed synchronicities, appeared to be linked by meaning rather than by mechanical cause and effect. As Jung defined it in his 1952 essay, Synchronicity and a Causal Connecting Principle. Synchronicity designates the parallelism of time and meaning between psychic and psychophysical events, which scientific knowledge so far has been unable to reduce to a common principle. This definition contains several crucial elements. First, synchronicity involves a coincidence in time, events occurring simultaneously or in close temporal proximity. Second, it involves a meaningful connection between these events that transcends mere chance. Third, it typically includes a correspondence between internal psychological states and external physical events that conventional causality cannot explain. Consider this example from Jung's own practice. A young woman in analysis was describing a dream about being given a golden scarab beetle. At that precise moment, Jung heard a tapping on his window. Opening it, he found a rose chafer beetle, the closest European equivalent to the scarab, which had flown in against all statistical probability. He caught it and presented it to his patient, saying, "Here's your scarab." This event exemplifies perfect synchronicity. The internal psychic event, the dream of the scarab, coincided with the external physical event, the appearance of a similar beetle, in a way that created striking meaning for both participants, but could not be explained through conventional causality. The beetle didn't cause the dream, nor did the dream cause the beetle to appear. They were connected not by causation, but by meaning. Jung observed numerous such occurrences, both in his practice and personal life. A wife dreams of a serious accident involving her husband at the exact time he experiences one hundreds of miles away. A person thinks of a long-forgotten friend moments before that friend calls after years of silence. Someone repeatedly encounters the same unusual number or symbol during a period of significant psychological transformation. Conventional explanations typically dismiss such occurrences as mere coincidence amplified by confirmation bias. We notice and remember the hits while forgetting the misses. But Jung found this explanation inadequate for several reasons. First, many synchronicities involve such mathematically improbable specificity that simple chance seems an insufficient explanation. Second, they often occur during periods of significant psychological transition or heightened emotional states, suggesting a non-random relationship to psychological processes. Third, they frequently carry a numinous quality, a sense of profound meaning or significance that transcends intellectual categorization. As Jung wrote, when coincidences pile up in this way, one cannot help being impressed by them, for the greater the number of terms in such a series, or the more unusual its character, the more improbable it becomes. This observation led him to propose something revolutionary. Alongside causality exists another organizing principle in nature, synchronicity, which connects events not through mechanical cause and effect, but through meaning and significance. This principle doesn't contradict causality, but complements it, operating in realms where causal explanations prove inadequate. The implications are profound. If synchronicity exists, as Jung described it, then meaning isn't merely a human psychological projection onto a meaningless universe, but a fundamental organizing principle in reality itself, connecting psyche and matter in ways our conventional scientific framework cannot fully explain. In our next section, we'll explore the specific conditions under which synchronicity typically occurs and why certain psychological states seem to attract or generate these meaningful coincidences. But first, consider this question. Have you experienced striking coincidences that seemed too meaningful to be mere chance? What quality distinguished these events from ordinary coincidences, and how did they affect your understanding of reality? The synchronistic field. When and why meaningful coincidences occur. While Jung believed synchronicity operates as a continuous underlying principle in reality, he observed that conscious experiences of meaningful coincidence occur most frequently under specific psychological conditions. Understanding these conditions helps explain why some people experience more synchronicities than others, and why these experiences often cluster during particular life periods. The first and most significant condition Jung identified is psychological transition. Periods when established patterns of consciousness are disrupted and the psyche is reorganizing itself. These might include major life transitions, career changes, relationship beginnings or endings, relocations, identity transformations, spiritual crises, or encounters with previously unconscious material. During such transitions, the rigid boundaries of conventional ego consciousness temporarily loosen, creating greater permeability between conscious and unconscious dimensions of the psyche. This permeability apparently increases the likelihood of synchronistic experiences, as if the reorganizing psyche attracts or generates external circumstances that mirror and facilitate its internal transformative process. As Jung wrote in Synchronicity, and a causal connecting principle, the psychoid archetype has a tendency to behave as though it were not localized in one person, but were active in the whole environment. The second condition is emotional activation, states of heightened feeling that energize unconscious contents and intensify their pressure on consciousness. Jung noted that synchronicities frequently occur during periods of deep love, intense grief, overwhelming anxiety, or profound wonder. These emotional states seem to create conditions where the boundary between internal and external reality becomes more permeable, allowing a meaningful connections to emerge. This observation suggests that synchronicity isn't a purely intellectual phenomenon, but involves what Jung called feeling-toned complexes, emotionally charged psychological patterns that organize experience around significant themes or relationships. When these complexes are strongly activated, they appear to attract corresponding external circumstances through what he termed field effects, analogous to electromagnetic fields in physics. The third condition is archetypal activation, the constellation of universal psychological patterns from the collective unconscious. Jung believed these archetypes aren't merely internal psychological structures, but psychoid realities that bridge psyche and matter. When powerfully constellated, they seem to organize not just internal experience, but external events into meaningful patterns that reflect their symbolic content. This explains why synchronicities often involve ancient symbolic patterns: birth and death, separation and union, transformation and renewal, creation and destruction. These archetypal themes represent fundamental patterns of human experience that transcend individual psychology, connecting personal circumstances to universal meanings in ways that can feel both deeply personal and transpersonally significant. The fourth condition is what Jung called abaissement du niveau mental, a temporary lowering of conscious discriminating judgment. This doesn't mean irrationality or confusion, but rather a state where rigid analytic thinking relaxes, allowing awareness of connections and patterns that conventional rationality might filter out. Meditation, contemplative practices, artistic immersion, nature exposure, and other activities that quiet the analytical mind can facilitate this state. Marie von Franz, Jung's close collaborator, described this state as a more humble, more quiet attitude of the ego, where one just observes what happens and what the unconscious produces. A positive regression, one might say in psychological terms, or an emptying of oneself in religious terminology. These conditions help explain the variability in synchronistic experiences among different individuals and cultures. People going through major life transitions, those with naturally permeable boundaries between conscious and unconscious, individuals engaged in contemplative or artistic pursuits, and cultures that maintain symbolic or mythic worldviews typically report more synchronistic experiences than those with stable conventional identities, rigid psychological boundaries, predominantly analytical thinking styles, or strictly materialist worldviews. Consider Emily, a management consultant whose life had followed a carefully planned trajectory until a sudden corporate downsizing left her unemployed at 45. This unexpected disruption created precisely the conditions for synchronicity, psychological transition, emotional activation, archetypal themes of death and rebirth, and disruption of her usually analytical mindset. During this period, she experienced a remarkable series of synchronicities. Books literally fell off shelves when she visited the library, opening to passages directly relevant to her situation. She repeatedly encountered people who mentioned opportunities she would never have considered in her previous career. Numbers meaningful from her childhood appeared on license plates at decision points. A chance encounter with a former client led to an unexpected career direction, combining her business experience with her long-dormant artistic talents. These weren't merely random events retrospectively assigned meaning. They occurred with striking specificity, emotional resonance, and timing that defied conventional probability. They carried what Jung called a numinous quality, a sense of meaningful connection to something larger than her individual circumstances. As Jung noted, synchronicity is not a philosophical view, but an empirical concept which postulates an intellectually necessary principle. In other words, once we truly engage with the evidence of such experiences, we may need to expand our understanding of reality to include organizing principles beyond conventional causality. In our next section, we'll explore the profound implications of synchronicity for our understanding of the relationship between mind and matter. But first, consider this question. Have you noticed patterns in when meaningful coincidences occur in your own life? How might Jung's observations about the conditions for synchronicity explain these patterns? The unus mundus, mind and matter, as complementary aspects of one reality. Jung's most revolutionary insight about synchronicity wasn't simply that meaningful coincidences exist as interesting anomalies. It was his recognition that these experiences might represent evidence for a more fundamental reality underlying both psyche and matter, what he called borrowing from medieval alchemy, the unus mundus, or one world. This concept suggests that what we experience as the separation between subjective psychology and objective physical reality is not absolute, but relative, the product of our typical conscious perspective, rather than an inherent division in reality itself. At a deeper level, mind and matter might be complementary manifestations of a unified reality that transcends both, yet contains both as aspects of itself. As Jung wrote in Mysterium Conjunctionis, synchronicity could be understood as an ordering system by means of which similar things coincide without having a causal connection, precisely because at the deeper level they are one and the same thing. This perspective aligns remarkably with developments in quantum physics occurring during Jung's lifetime, particularly through his long collaboration with physicist Wolfgang Pauli, one of the pioneers of quantum theory. Pauli recognized that the observer problem in quantum physics, the way observation appears to influence quantum events, suggested connections between consciousness and physical reality that classical physics couldn't accommodate. Together, Jung and Pauli explored how synchronicity might represent a bridge between psychological and physical understanding, a principle operating in the borderland between mind and matter, where their apparent separation dissolves into more fundamental unity. This unity isn't mystical speculation, but addresses genuine limitations in our conventional frameworks. Causality works admirably for explaining many physical processes, but breaks down when attempting to explain consciousness itself or the relationship between subjective experience and objective events. Synchronicity offers a complementary principle that addresses precisely these limitations. Jung proposed that both causality and synchronicity might be special cases of a more comprehensive ordering principle in nature, what he sometimes called a causal orderedness. Causality governs the realm of energy and force in space-time, while synchronicity governs the realm of meaning and significance across the psyche-matter spectrum. As he explained, synchronicity consists of two factors. A, an unconscious image comes into consciousness, either directly, i.e., literally, or indirectly, symbolized or suggested in the form of a dream, idea, or premonition. B, an objective situation coincides with this content. The one is as puzzling as the other. This formulation hints at a profound understanding that what we typically perceive as separate realms, the subjective world in here and the objective world out there, might actually be complementary aspects of a unified reality that appears as either psyche or matter, depending on our observational perspective. Modern theoretical physics has continued developing perspectives that align with this understanding. David Bohm's concepts of implicate order and explicate order suggest that our everyday reality, the explicate order, emerges from a deeper, unified field, the implicate order, where conventional distinctions between mind and matter dissolve. Similarly, quantum entanglement demonstrates non-local connections between particles that transcend conventional space-time limitations. These parallels don't prove Jung's concept scientifically, but they suggest his intuitions about reality's deeper structure align with directions in contemporary physics that challenge conventional materialist assumptions about the separation between consciousness and physical reality. The implications extend beyond theoretical interest to practical understanding of human experience. If synchronicity represents a genuine principle in nature, then the meaning we perceive in coincidences isn't merely subjective projection, but recognition of actual patterns in reality that conventional cause-effect thinking can't adequately capture. Consider Michael, a physicist whose career had been built on strictly materialist assumptions until he experienced a series of synchronicities following his father's death. Books would repeatedly fall open to passages about father-son relationships. Strangers would spontaneously share stories about their fathers. Numbers significant in his relationship with his father appeared with uncanny frequency. Initially, Michael dismissed these as selective attention amplified by grief. But their specificity, timing, and numinous quality gradually led him to consider whether something more fundamental might be involved, whether these experiences might represent genuine connections between his psychological process and external events that his conventional scientific framework couldn't explain. This openness didn't require abandoning scientific rigor, but expanding it to include phenomena that transcend current explanatory models. As Nobel physicist Wolfgang Pauli wrote in his correspondence with Jung, "It is my personal opinion that in the science of the future reality will neither be psychic nor physical, but somehow both, and somehow neither." This somehow both and somehow neither perspective represents not regression to pre-scientific magical thinking, but potential evolution toward more comprehensive understanding that integrates objective and subjective dimensions of experience rather than artificially separating them. In our next section, we'll explore practical approaches to working with synchronicity in everyday life. But first, consider this question. How might your understanding of reality change if mind and matter aren't fundamentally separate but complementary aspects of a deeper, unified reality? What experiences in your own life might make more sense within this framework than within conventional causal explanations alone? Living synchronistically, practical approaches to meaningful coincidence. If synchronicity represents a genuine ordering principle in nature rather than mere subjective fantasy, how might we develop more conscious relationship with this dimension of experience? Jung offered several practical approaches that remain relevant today. Methods for cultivating awareness of meaningful coincidence without falling into superstition or magical thinking. The first approach involves developing what Jung called symbolic attitude, the capacity to perceive events not just literally in terms of their apparent causal connections, but symbolically in terms of their potential meaning and significance. This doesn't mean abandoning causal understanding, but complementing it with attention to the patterns of meaning that connect apparently unrelated events. Cultivate this attitude by regularly asking questions like, if this event were a symbol or message rather than mere coincidence, what might it signify? How does it relate to my current psychological process or life questions? What pattern might it represent within my broader life narrative? This questioning doesn't impose arbitrary meaning on random events, but creates receptivity to meaningful patterns that might otherwise remain beneath conscious threshold. It represents what physicist and philosopher Henry Bortoft called active seeing, a participatory mode of perception that engages with phenomenon rather than merely observing it from detached perspective. The second approach involves maintaining what Jungian analyst Robert Johnson called a slender thread of attention to synchronistic events through practices like journaling, contemplation, or dialogue with trusted others. Recording meaningful coincidences creates a record that reveals patterns over time while preventing both dismissive skepticism and over-interpretation of isolated incidents. Marie, a literature professor, maintained a synchronicity journal for decades, noting meaningful coincidences without immediately interpreting them. Reviewing this journal periodically revealed striking patterns she would have missed otherwise. Thematic connections between seemingly unrelated events, cyclical timing of significant coincidences, and correlations between synchronistic clusters and major psychological transitions in her life. The third approach involves developing discernment about which coincidences merit attention as potentially synchronistic and which represent mere random juxtapositions. Jung identified several criteria for this discernment. Statistical improbability. The more mathematically unlikely the coincidence, the more it suggests potential synchronicity. Psychological significance. Meaningful coincidences typically connect to emotionally charged complexes or significant life themes rather than trivial matters. Archetypal resonance. Synchronicities often reflect universal patterns: birth, death, separation, union, transformation, rather than merely personal associations. Numinous quality. Genuine synchronicities typically carry a sense of profound meaning or significance that transcends intellectual explanation. These criteria help distinguish potentially meaningful synchronicities from the random coincidences that inevitably occur through statistical probability alone. They focus attention on experiences that might genuinely reflect the ordering principle Jung identified rather than arbitrary pattern seeking in meaningless coincidence. The fourth approach involves cultivating synchronistic awareness through practices that temporarily quiet analytical thinking and enhance receptivity to non-causal connections. These might include meditation, time in nature, contemplative arts, or other activities that create what psychologists call defocused attention, a relaxed but alert awareness that notice patterns conventional focus might miss. Contemporary research in cognitive psychology supports this approach. Studies on the default mode network in the brain suggest that relaxing, focused analytical attention activates brain regions associated with pattern recognition, metaphorical thinking, and perception of connections between apparently unrelated content. Precisely the cognitive conditions that would enhance awareness of synchronistic meaning. The fifth approach involves what Jung called active imagination, conscious engagement with unconscious content through creative dialogue rather than passive receptivity or intellectual analysis. This practice creates bridge between conscious and unconscious dimensions of the psyche that appears particularly conducive to synchronistic experience. David, an architect who practiced active imagination regularly, noticed striking correlations between themes emerging in his imaginative dialogues and seemingly random events in his external environment. Client requests would mysteriously align with symbols from his recent visualizations. Chance encounters would reflect themes from his inner dialogue. Books would appear containing information directly relevant to his imaginal explorations. These coincidences weren't simply random events retrospectively assigned meaning, but displayed specificity, timing, and thematic coherence that suggested genuine connection between his psychological process and external circumstances, the defining characteristic of synchronicity, as Jung defined it. Finally, Jung emphasized approaching synchronicity with appropriate epistemological humility, neither dismissing such experiences through rigid skepticism nor claiming certainty about their ultimate nature. He maintained epistemological criticism about both conventional materialist explanations that reduce all meaning to subjective projection and metaphysical systems that make absolute claims about reality's ultimate structure. This balanced approach neither rejects synchronicity as mere superstition, nor embraces it as proof of specific religious or metaphysical beliefs. It remains open to the phenomenon while maintaining critical awareness about interpretations, creating space for genuine engagement with meaningful coincidence without predetermined conclusions about its ultimate nature. As Jung wrote, meaningful coincidences are thinking as of a causative factor existing on the same level as the effect, and thus operating in violation of the axiom causa aequat effectum, the cause equals the effect. But they require a factor of another dimension, namely the equivalence of meaning. The bridge between worlds, synchronicity's profound implications. We began with a question. What if every random coincidence in your life is actually a message? We've explored Jung's controversial concept of synchronicity as a causal connecting principle, the psychological conditions that facilitate meaningful coincidence, and the radical possibility that synchronicity represents evidence for a deeper reality, where psyche and matter emerge as complementary aspects of unified wholeness. Now, we arrive at the profound implications of this understanding for how we might comprehend both our individual lives and reality itself. If synchronicity exists as Jung described it, then meaning isn't merely human projection onto a meaningless universe, but an actual organizing principle in nature, connecting psychological and physical dimensions of reality through patterns that transcend conventional causality. This perspective fundamentally challenges the modern materialist worldview that treats consciousness as merely an epiphenomenon of physical processes, suggesting instead that consciousness and matter might be complementary manifestations of a more fundamental reality that includes both. As Jung wrote in his correspondence with Pauli, "It seems to me that the synchronistic phenomena point to a background that cannot be grasped by our usual categories of space and time. This background represents what contemporary physicist David Bohm might call the implicate order, a deeper dimension of reality from which both psychological and physical phenomena unfold in patterns that occasionally reveal their hidden connections through synchronistic events. These events serve as glimpses into a more comprehensive reality that our conventional scientific framework partially describes but cannot fully contain. For contemporary science, synchronicity represents both challenge and opportunity. It challenges the arbitrary exclusion of subjective meaning from scientific consideration, the methodological decision to treat consciousness as outside nature rather than integral to it. It offers opportunity to develop more comprehensive understanding that includes both objective causality and meaningful connection as complementary principles rather than competing explanations. Recent developments in both physics and consciousness studies suggest increasing scientific receptivity to such integrated understanding. Quantum mechanics continues revealing non-local connections and observer effects that challenge conventional materialist assumptions. Consciousness studies increasingly recognize limitations in reductive explanations of subjective experience. Complex systems theory identifies emergent properties and self-organizing principles that transcend simple causality. These developments don't prove synchronicity in conventional scientific terms, but create conceptual space for serious consideration of organizing principles beyond mechanical causation, precisely what Jung proposed through his collaboration with Pauli and other scientists of his era. Beyond scientific implications, synchronicity offers profound practical perspective on individual human experience. It suggests that the search for meaning isn't arbitrary projection, but engagement with patterns that genuinely connect psychological and physical dimensions of reality. The meaning we perceive in coincidences may represent genuine recognition of connections our conventional frameworks artificially separate. This understanding transforms how we might approach life's apparent randomness. What seems like meaningless chance from causal perspective might reveal purposeful pattern when viewed synchronistically. The job loss that appears as senseless misfortune might synchronistically connect to psychological development requiring new direction. The chance encounter that changes everything might reflect meaningful pattern beyond apparent accident. This doesn't mean abandoning critical thinking or assuming mystical explanation for every coincidence. It means developing more comprehensive epistemology that includes both causal analysis and synchronistic awareness, understanding that reality might be simultaneously more orderly than conventional materialism allows in its meaningful patterns and less deterministic than classical physics assumed in its quantum and synchronistic dimensions. As Jung's collaborator, Marie-Louise von Franz wrote, "If one regards the unconscious as being on the one hand a product of our psyche, and on the other hand, as possessing an objective structure whose factors can manifest themselves synchronistically in outer events, then one has to describe it as a psychoid structure, i.e., as something which is in a certain sense psychic, but at the same time can manifest itself in physical reality. This psychoid nature of reality, neither exclusively mental nor exclusively physical, but a deeper unity that manifests as both, offers perspective that integrates rather than polarizes subjective and objective dimensions of experience. It suggests that meaning isn't merely subjective human invention, but perception of patterns inherent in reality itself. Patterns that occasionally become visible through synchronistic events that bridge inner and outer worlds. As you reflect on tonight's exploration of Jung's concept of synchronicity, consider this question. How might your understanding of both your individual life journey and reality itself change if meaningful connection represents not mere subjective projection, but actual principle operating alongside causality in nature? What seemingly random events in your life might reveal their place in meaningful pattern when viewed through synchronistic awareness rather than causal analysis alone? Remember Jung's core insight. Synchronicity suggests that alongside the causal connections we typically recognize exists another ordering principle based on meaning and significance rather than mechanical cause and effect. This principle doesn't contradict causality, but complements it, operating in dimensions where causal explanation proves inadequate, particularly in the relationship between psychological experience and physical events. The meaningful coincidences we experience might not be random chance or selective attention, but glimpses into a deeper reality, where psyche and matter emerge from common source, where meaning exists not just in human minds, but in the very fabric of existence itself. This perspective doesn't require abandoning scientific understanding, but expanding it to include dimensions of experience our conventional frameworks artificially exclude. In a world increasingly fragmented by artificial separation between objective and subjective domains, between scientific materialism and psychological meaning, synchronicity offers bridge between worlds, perspective that honors both the objective pattern science reveals and the meaningful connections that give human life its depth and purpose, not by choosing one over the other, but by recognizing both as complementary aspects of a reality more comprehensive than either alone can fully capture. What meaningful coincidences might be waiting for your recognition? And how might consciousness of these connections transform your understanding of both yourself and the world you inhabit?